Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. Every year, 17 million animals perish in America's scientific laboratories. Most of these are rats and mice, but the death list includes 180,000 dogs, 50,000 cats, 61,000 primates, and 500,000 each of guinea pigs and rabbits. The lives and deaths of many of these animals are squalid and painful. On the other hand, experiments on animals have been essential to many medical advances for humanity, including almost every new vaccine and surgical technique. Right now, monkeys are being given AIDS so that human beings might one day be cured of it. In the past 10 or 15 years, an animal liberation movement has grown up to protest the exploitation of animals by human beings. At its least controversial, the movement concentrates on fur coats made from endangered species and on lab experiments that are unnecessary or gratuitously cruel. Most scientists now agree that there was a lot of callousness in the recent past, and that at least some animal experiments can be replaced by, for example, computer models. But extreme animal liberationists go a lot further. They say that animal rights are indistinguishable from human rights, and that no human benefit, however great, justifies the taking of an animal's life. Some animal liberationists have resorted to guerrilla warfare, including violence, against labs where animals are used for experiments. Mr. Buckley's guest today, Dr. Sherwin Nuland, is an attending surgeon at the Yale New Haven Hospital and is the author of a history of medicine called Doctors. He is the Yale medical community's spokesman on animal rights. The Yale animal community did not send us a spokesman on medical rights. Mr. Buckley, if you share Dr. Nuland's general view that animal rights are subordinate to those of human beings and that experiments are justified for that reason, I hope you'll at least touch on the question of why the same logic should not apply to a first trimester fetus, which is certainly further down the evolutionary scale than, say, a laboratory experiment chimpanzee.
Well, I distinguish between a fetus and an animal for reasons, well, I suppose for taxonomic reasons. They're different things. But the introduction made by Mr. Kinsley serves as an effective polarization, doesn't it? Let me begin by asking you this. Does any discussion on the question of what consideration ought to be given to animals begin by excluding the two extremes, the extremes that say no animal should be touched no matter what, and the extreme that says there's no reason to show any concern for animals?
I don't know that there's any spokesman for that second point of view. I'm sure that there is no one in the scientific community who feels that there should be no concern for animals. The fact of the matter is that the first formal suggestions, the first formal proposals for animal welfare in scientific laboratories came from a group of scientists at the National Institutes of Health in 1963. The scientific community would consider itself very badly served by anyone who felt that animals have no legitimate rights, because rights gets to be a very complicated question, as you can imagine, but no legitimate reasons that their welfare should be looked out for by those scientists who work with them.
Well, are you saying that 1963 was the first time that there was a consolidation of sentiment among medical doctors on this point?
No. As a matter of fact, it began at the turn of the century as more and more animals were being used for the beginnings of real medical science in the United States. Medical scientists began to formulate rules, but the actual formalization in the sense of recommendations for congressional action, for action by states, came out of the National Institutes of Health in the 60s, 1961 or 3, I can't remember the exact year.
Now, did the movement correspond at all with the revelations back around just before the First World War of the means by which animals were slaughtered? Or are you distinguishing between the use of animals for scientific reasons and the use of animals for human feeding?
I think for the purposes of this discussion, it's probably better to focus on the scientific use of animals.
I do, but I just didn't know whether there had been any correlation between the two movements.
There's no question that any movement on one side results in a movement on the other side. I think that had the animal welfare groups not been as active as they have been, and here I distinguish between the animal welfare movement and the animal rights movement. Many writers have distinguished between them. And there's a considerable difference between the way they function and what their hope for an end product should be. I think had there not been an animal welfare movement, there would have continued to be, on the part of some scientists, a significant amount of callousness in the way laboratory animals are treated.
Mm-hmm. You have arrived at a position that represents the views of the overwhelming majority of the scientific profession. That's safe to say, isn't it?
The overwhelming majority of the scientific profession, and if a recent Gallup poll is any measure, 80% of the American people.
Okay, now, what is the basis of a moral concern for, quote, animal rights, as you understand it?
The concept of rights, as opposed to animal welfare, as opposed to our legitimate concern for experimental animals, really began in the early 1970s. There were a number of books that were written. There was one in particular by a philosopher in Australia, a young man named Peter Berger, whose idea it is that regardless of species, rights should be equal, that there is a moral equivalent between all species. And he developed a concept that he calls, and has been called to this day, speciesism, which he says is equivalent to the evil of racism, sexism, you name it. And believe it or not, this kind of thinking has fascinated a number of otherwise quite sane people who use terms like speciesism, accuse those of us in the medical community and the scientific community of being speciesists. And I must say that one of the reasons I'm here is that I am indeed a speciesist.
And their point really is that there is no difference between a worm and a human being in terms of the respect that has to be paid.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
We can dismiss them, can't we?
We can, but they are not dismissed by a large number of people who contribute considerable amounts of money to fringe organizations with names like the Animal Liberation Front. The Animal Liberation Front, under the name of speciesism, has caused considerable damage to many scientific institutions in this country. There have been approximately 25 terrorist attacks on university research centers in the last 3 or 4 years. Things have gone so far that Scotland Yard has recently called the Animal Liberation Front, after the IRA, the most dangerous terrorist organization in the United Kingdom.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, of course, England's always been a little cuckoo that way, haven't they?
A lot of old ladies in tennis shoes.
Yeah. I remember when the Russians set up that dog on their 3rd satellite, Mutnik, they call it, didn't they? I remember thinking, God, if they bring that dog back alive, we're going to lose the Cold War. that being the English preoccupation with pets, which reaches beyond their preoccupation for children. It's often been alleged anyway. Well, so how do you struggle to countenance that simply by reminding people of the rewards of using animals for human welfare? Who was it? It was some woman quoted by you in something you wrote who prevailed upon a jury by bringing in 18 or 20 healthy people who were alive as a result of certain experiments that had been conducted on animals. Am I correct?
Well, we live in the era of modern cardiac surgery. We live at a period where every year there is some 200,000 or more open heart operations. Scarcely one of us in this place or in the audience that will be hearing this show doesn't know someone who's had coronary bypass surgery, for example, or congenital heart disease surgery. There isn't a single operation in the cardiac surgeon's armamentarium that didn't come out of dog research, whether it was basic research on the physiology of heart disease or whether it was research that enabled people to work out the techniques. What happened in the case that we're talking about here is the first blue baby operation. Helen Taussig and a surgeon at Hopkins named Blaylock invented this thing. They invented it based on a number of operations, hundreds that he had done to work out physiological problems involving the way the heart pumps blood to the lungs and the way the lungs aerate the blood. And based on those, they worked out the theoretical construct for the operation. They then went back to the laboratory, got their technique organized so that they could do it. The result was that within months, the operation was being done all over the world. Hundreds of children whose longevity was measured in months, if not weeks, were now able to function reasonably normally. It turned out that the mid-40s, when all of this happened, was one of the great flare-ups of animal welfare people, and they were trying to get the legislature in Baltimore to pass an anti-vivisectionist law. Well, she came to the hearings. There was to be a referendum, brought with her a number of her patients, and many of them brought their pet dogs. The result was that the referendum was defeated something like 4-1 in the election that took place about a month later.
Well, what point would you be prepared to yield to the animal lovers as distinguished from the animal fetishists, the speciesists? We'll take them out of the fur coat. Now, is there a presumption against a fur coat because once it was a part of a mink?
I think the problem with fur coats gets to be so very complicated by endangered species and this kind of thing. I don't know a lot about the animal welfare people's complaints about fur coats. I have the feeling their real concern has to do with the way these animals are treated, the way they're housed. Some of those concerns are very legitimate concerns, as some of their concerns about some of our laboratories are legitimate concerns. It's my thesis that no one cleans up his act unless he's attacked a little bit. And I think that the animal welfare movement over the course of these 7 or 8 decades when it's been active in the United States has done some important things to help us stop making the kinds of errors that as medical scientists we have made in the past.
Yeah, letting white mice starve to death from neglect, that kind of thing.
That used to happen. I think some of the larger animals were not treated as well as they might have been. Obviously, most scientists care a great deal about their animals. Anyone who has done research with large animals like dogs or chimps or whatever understands the kind of affection that you develop for those individuals as you care for them week after week, month after month. But nevertheless, there were conditions in some laboratories, in some schools, probably in some drug companies, that were not as good as they might have been. I think they're vastly improved today. For some of that, we owe our opponents in the animal welfare group. But there's a difference, and I mentioned this earlier, between those people who are proponents of what we call animal welfare and those people who are proponents of what they call animal rights. The difference, of course, being, do animals have rights in the true theological, moral, philosophical, sociological sense as human beings do, or do they not?
Yeah, I think I would tend to phrase that, do human beings have obligations? And I would say yes. I would say animals have no rights, but we have an obligation not to amuse ourselves by treating sadistically any animal or wantonly. But now, is that something we can simply leave to the ethos to govern, or is that something that requires state action, the protection of animal welfare?
I think it has required state action. Unfortunately, some of the state action has been a little thoughtless, and one of the examples of that kind of state action is the problem that we are now having with pound animals. Approximately 2% of dogs or cats that go to a pound in the past have been used for scientific research. There are several states, and my own state of Connecticut is one of them, in which the animal rights activists have succeeded in getting the legislature to pass a law saying you can't use pound dogs anymore. This in spite of several studies, one done in Georgia, one done in Michigan, indicating that people who bring their dogs to a pound would be very pleased to have them used for scientific research. About 75% of people would. What has happened, therefore, is the expense of doing scientific research where dogs are involved has considerably increased. There's a pound law in Massachusetts. It's been estimated that the increase is about $6 million overall in the state of Massachusetts, because dogs either have to be brought in from elsewhere, or if these laws go through in every state, dogs will have to be specially bred for research purposes. Now, we've already got a situation where the federal government is only able to fund 25% or less of research requests because there isn't enough money. As the cost of each research project increases considerably because of the increased cost of animals, there'll be less and less new research funded.
And that is an absorbable cost in the sense that it can be passed right on to the consumer, or is that actually going to put a brake on medical progress?
There is no consumer. It puts a brake on medical progress. There's a finite amount of money that is budgeted for research.
Right.
Goes through the National Institutes of Health.
Yeah.
And if a given project, let's say the development of a new operation, costs 25% more because of very tight restrictions on where the animals come from, how they must be cared for beyond the need just simply for humane care, there's that much less money.
Let me, if I may, deviate just a little bit from the straight animal argument to ask your views on this controversy about the price being charged by the developers of whatever it is that helps AIDS. It's some drug, which comes to $7,000 per year. Now, are there 2 points of view about that, or ought it to be subject to a straight market adjudication, i.e. they have it, some people need it and want it, and they are justified in getting whatever price they can for it?
The only legitimate argument in favor of market adjudication is the great contributions that drug companies have made to medical research over the years.
The capital they've invested into.
Exactly. But that's not much of an argument in this situation. I think we've come to a problem in society, in this world, that has not only medical and scientific implications, but obviously social implications for our civilization, for the kind of civilization we are, for the morality of how we treat fellow man who does have rights. I think it's incumbent on any drug company that has a product like this one, and of course AZT is making a significant difference, not only for people who already have AIDS, but it seems to hold off the development of AIDS in virus-positive patients. I think a company that has a product like that should have 2 things happen to it. One is it should be subsidized by the government. Its research should be subsidized by the government. And there should be the understanding that profits should only be of such a level that they are legitimate, that they are not the kinds of profits that are made from ordinary drug company researches. This is an unusual problem. It has never occurred in our lifetime, at least not our adult lifetime. Syphilis was such a problem until the 40s. Tuberculosis was such a problem until the 50s. But this is a scourge of civilization. If you've got the answer to it, how will this look to historians at the very least 100 years from now, if there are people who don't get it because it's too costly?
So therefore, a means should be devised by which to make it available. That means, of course, doesn't necessarily have to be governmental means. We spend $100 billion a year in philanthropy, which is much more than you would need to satisfy that particular demand. Now, in the development of this ATZ, were animals used?
Animals have not been used in the development of that, but there is a chimpanzee model for the virus. There has never been yet a primate or any other animal in which one could instill the virus and make it take. But there are now a number of studies going in which the virus has been put into animals. Now, the shortest period of time, I should say the longest period of time, is 4 years. So we still don't know if any of those animals will develop AIDS. But if an animal model can be developed for AIDS, that will be a huge step forward.
Because then you use that animal for these experiments.
We use the animal for experiments for the drugs themselves, but there are a number of things about the nature of that disease, what it does to the immune process, that we don't know. And they can obviously be done on patients, and most of them are, because we get tissue samples, unfortunately autopsy samples. But the ongoing type of study one can do with animals is beyond, obviously, what one can do in human beings, particularly drug testing.
Well, is the lobby that you began by describing growing in power to the point that it might actually arrest progress when you reach the point where you successfully transmitted the virus of AIDS to animals?
I'm convinced that the ultimate goal of the animal rights people, as opposed to most of the animal welfare people, is the abolition of all research that involves animals, which means the abolition of all research as we have known it in biomedicine in the 20th century.
No, but I'm asking, are they acquiring sufficient political force to intimidate you, or can we go home safely and simply remember that 80% statistic that you began by reciting?
Right. There are approximately 400 animal welfare and rights organizations in the United States.
Great heavens.
The amount of money contributed to those organizations is in the range of $200 million, which is significantly more than the scientific establishment has to fight them. $200 million and a lot of glitzy, glamorous names. Bob Barker, who I'm told is a talk show host, not a talk show host, a game show host, arrived in New Haven at the head of a contingent of people demanding that all the laboratories working in psychological research at the Yale Medical School be closed down. There are other big names that have become associated with this. Our own legislature, pretty enlightened legislature in general, has stopped us, as I said earlier, from getting pound dogs. Massachusetts, same thing has happened.
Is there an Animal Liberation League at Yale?
Not at Yale, but right across the street. As a matter of fact, there was a great confrontation between our medical students and this group of people who came. You know about the...
What happens across the street, Harvard?
Intellectually down the street. No, you know, the director of the U.S. Surgical Corporation, which makes surgical staples, had an attempt made on his life. So it isn't just a question of political maneuvering. There have been now enough laws passed to make it more difficult to do research, certainly more costly to do research. The Animal Welfare Act of 1985, the Congressional Act, is being reviewed right now. And if the animal rights people get what they want, the restrictions will be so tight, so difficult to get around, cost-wise, that there will be a great decrease in the amount of research that can be done.
And it must be one of your purposes to reinforce the lobby that counteracts the efforts of these people in local legislatures.
Yes, yes.
Surely you find it relatively easy to engage the attention of people when you plead your own case.
Well, there isn't anyone in this country who has not benefited from animal research.
Yeah, right.
There isn't anyone whose child who hasn't had measles vaccine or a smallpox inoculation. People just don't realize what animal research has done, and once it's pointed out, people are stunned by the contributions that animals have made and animal researchers have made to general health in this country, because people don't know about it.
Have you found from your experience that legislators are pretty easy to win around when you do explain it to them?
Better make that a yes or no.
No.
No, there you go. Thank you very much, Dr. Nuland. You know, Mr. Buckley, it seems to me you let Dr. Nuland pull somewhat of a fast one here with this distinction between animal welfare and animal rights. Now, you say, well, animals have no rights, but we human beings have obligations. I find that logic very difficult to follow. Why do we have the obligation? Why should we even have to worry about animal welfare if they have no rights?
Well, I think it's a part of the Christian ethos, using that word broadly, to avoid the infliction of pain. It can go to extreme lengths by banning, say, fox hunting and so on and so forth. I remember once as a boy attending a retreat conducted by a Jesuit who said that an old lady came to him and said to him, "Father, do dogs go to heaven? And he said, well, no, actually, there's no dogma on that point. And she said, well, I won't be happy in heaven unless Fufu is there with me. To which he answered, which was wonderfully Jesuitical, if you won't be happy without Fufu in heaven, Fufu will go to heaven. And that, I thought, was a wonderfully liberating perspective on the points that we're here to discuss. So I do think that we have an obligation to look after animals, but that obligation is severely defined by an obligation to look after human beings. And if I understand you, this is what this research is engaged in.
Exactly.
Thank you.